Morning, gentlemen.
Good morning.
Morning. So, Rabbi, I think I figured out what I was doing wrong. I think rather than starting a new meeting, I had to go to the meetings that the rabbi had previously set. So that was the problem. I just
Oh,
went to
yes,
start
yes,
meeting.
yes, you
So I
have.
can't hear you. Oh, that's because I'm not plugged in here.
Mhm.
I don't know whether you heard me, Rabbi. Um, so I hopefully it'll work this morning.
All right, great. Thank
And
you.
the other question I had was, it's okay to put the phone on the table, even though the Sefer Torah is going there this morning?
Yes, yes, that's fine.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, so good morning, everyone. The next eight seifim in the Rav Shulchan Aruch are very straightforward. There's actually no commentary on them. They provide us with eight different or more examples of medieval business practices. So many of these will be practical, but many of them will be not practical for modern times. And we'll have to make the application ourselves to whatever would be comparable. So if anyone wants to jump in and say, oh, I can come up with a contemporary example of this thing, please let us know. So in Sifyu Test, we're going to talk about the selling of meat or different meat products. Asr lenafeach bikirbayim kidei sheyerau shmeinim urachavim. So you're not allowed to blow up the intestines. Now, the intestines of the animal is a very sellable commodity, right? But let's say so people would buy the kishkas all the time, but you want to blow them up so that the animal looks like it's very fatty and wide, when in reality it's filled with air. So that you're not allowed to do. Another example with meat is va'asur lishros basar b'mayim kidei sheyalbin v'yehei nir'eh. Let's see, v'yehei nir'eh. I lost part of the screen. Shamein, and that it should look fatty. You're also not allowed to soak meat in water so that it starts to get a little bit whiter and therefore to look fattier. That's again in medieval times they wanted meat to look fatty. Um, so I know that a contemporary example of this is adding ice to ground meat. Have you ever heard of that practice? At adding crushed ice to ground meat is a very common practice. There is actually I'm sure Canada has the similar laws to the U.S. USDA laws certify, they require a certain water content in ground beef. You can't have more than a certain ice or water content within ground beef. They do allow a certain percentage of crushed ice to be mixed into ground beef, but beyond a certain percentage, you can be fined. And the like meat packers in most Western countries are very strict about certain standards. So he writes then, so he says, so when it comes to fraudulent practices, typically butchers would want to make their meat look bigger and fattier. So you're not allowed to do anything deceptive. V'min hakol hakatzavim lasos came, v'hakol yodim miminhagam yesh mishamatir. He says, but if all of the butchers do this, if this is a common butcher practice, and then there and everyone is aware of this practice, so then some poskim say that it's mutter because all you're doing is keeping up with the market practice. Lefi she'ein kan ona'ah kevin shehakol yodim miminhagam. And the reason why it's not ona'ah is because people are aware, the public is aware that this is a common practice, and therefore they know that when they buy a piece of meat, they have to inspect it carefully. Just because it's white doesn't mean it's fat. It could be that it's a bone or something else. V'shomer nafsho yirchak mizeh, ki af al pi chen yeshlachu sheyisbor hakona shehu shamin be'emes. He says, but the fact is, he writes in parentheses, that a God-fearing butcher should distance himself even from a common practice that butchers do. And he says, because who knows, this particular customer may actually mistakenly interpret this white piece to be fat. Shahrei yesh harbe shemenim ba'olam, ubishvil kenosim ken kol hakatzavim. He says, because when you consider it, he says, why do butchers engage in this practice in the first place? Their whole objective is in the hope that people will interpret this white piece of meat to be fat instead of meat. Again, it's in today we trim the fat. In those days, the attitude was the more fat, the healthier, the better, right? So, yes, it's true that people are aware that this is a common practice to soak the meat in water so that it'll look more fatty. But at the end of the day, yes, you can justify the practice if it's the convention of where you live. But he adds in parentheses that a God-fearing butcher should be careful in this as well, because who knows, maybe this fellow will actually believe that it's fatty, and it'll turn out that he'll be disappointed when he gets home. Okay. Chaf. Asr la'arev ma'at perot b'harbei perot yafim shelo yihiyu nikarim bahem. So what you're not allowed to do is, let's say you have a bunch of grade A produce, and you take, let's say, a small amount of grade B produce, and you mix it in with the grade A produce. So your objective here is to create a greater level of volume for a lower amount of money for yourself. And you're going to pass it all off as grade A. So because the customer is not going to know that there's a small percentage of grade B mixed in. V'yimkar hakol b'cheskas yafim. V'afilu shneim yafim ela she'echad yafim mechaveiro. He says, and this is true even if they're both good quality, but one happens to be a higher quality than the other. You're not allowed to mix in a small amount of the lesser quality because the assumption is that it's all of the same quality. So this again is an act of deception. V'chadash v'yashan asur la'ariv zeh bazeh. And then when we get, so this is agricultural products. It could be referring to apples. It could be referring to grain. Okay, and then he says, as far as mixing old grain with new grain, you're also not supposed to mix old grain with new grain, or old grain in new grain. Ki hayashan osa kemach harbe yoser mehachadash, v'hachadash yafa mimenu im halokech rotza la'achnisa la'otzer liyashna. He says, because old grain and new grain, sometimes they could even be the same price, because each one has its advantages and disadvantages. Old grain, aged grain from the previous season, actually has a higher yield of flour. When you grind older grain, it yields more flour, I guess, because it has a lower liquid content, and therefore it creates more flour. I guess the size of if they're of equal size, a new kernel of grain and an old kernel of grain, there's greater density within the older kernel, and therefore it produces more flour. On the other hand, a kernel of grain from the new season, a freshly harvested kernel, actually is more desirable for a different reason, because people who wish to store grain in a silo prefer to buy new grain, because when you purchase old grain, I guess for whatever reason it doesn't have as much shelf life as the new grain. So it all depends upon why a person wants to buy the grain. If he wants to buy it to grind it right away, then old grain is better. If he wants to buy the grain to keep it in his silo for an extended period of time, then new grain is better. And therefore, a merchant can't say, well, what difference does it make? They don't, doesn't make a difference to the consumer. The point is that it does make a difference to the consumer. And what you think doesn't make a difference will make a difference. And therefore, he's going to think that it's either all old or all new. And he's going to be disappointed. And therefore, you can't misrepresent. Next, Chaf Aleph. Hatagar muter likach peros tovim v'roim mikama mekomos v'litna mimegura echas limkor mimena. So he says a tagar is a retailer, and he buys from a bunch of different suppliers, okay? And he's allowed to purchase a whole bunch of different kinds of produce of good and bad quality from multiple places, and he can put them all into one container or one trough for his customers to purchase. Afilu ein haroim nikorim mipnei miutam o mipnei shedomim letovim b'mar isam. He says, even if the varying qualities of produce are not distinguishable from each other. And the reason is lefisha kol yodim shu konami makomos. He says, because everyone recognizes that this is not a grower himself and that he's purchasing from multiple places. I mean, that's what his business model is as a retailer who purchases from multiple sources. And therefore, as such, anyone who's a customer of his knows that he has multiple suppliers and he cannot always control a uniform quality in the product that he sells. V'yesh b'megura shemochra mimena ta'arovis tovara uv'cheskes kein kona mimena. And therefore, everyone knows when they come to his store that the trough of grain that he's going to be selling from contains all different kinds of qualities of grain, and therefore there's no deception in that case. Uvilvad, shelo yiskaven likach harov mimakom hatov, kidei sheyetze alav hakol shuhu kona hakol mimakom hatov, v'kona gam mimakom hara uma'arvo imo be'inyan sheno nikarbo. But that's provided that there's no deception involved. So, for example, he says what would not be okay is if he buys from multiple sources, but he lets his customers know that he primarily purchases from the high quality sources and allows himself to gain the reputation that he only purchases from the highest quality farmlands. And then he mixes in, like we said before, a small percentage of the bad quality grain into the grade A grain. In other words, if he develops a reputation, whether by signage or by any other way, that he only sells grade A grain, and then he mixes in a little bit of grade B grain, that's going to be usher. Okay, so it all depends on the scenario. Okay, next, Chaf Beis. Makom shenagu la'ariv mayim biyayin bein hagitos, shahayayin toses, v'hamayim misarvim bo yafa v'nasim yayin. He says, in wine manufacturing, when the wine has just been freshly pressed and it's fermenting, so there is a custom in certain locales to mix in a certain percentage of water at that time. And the reason why they do that is because at that stage of fermentation, a small amount of water that's mixed in with the wine actually ferments together with the wine and contributes to the overall quality of the wine. So if that's the minhag of where you are, so then mutter la'arev kishir shadarkam la'arev, so then you would be allowed to do that as well if you're a wine manufacturer, a vintner, and v'limkor stam, and to sell it as wine, period, without having to reveal that there's a certain percentage of water contained inside. Ve'in kanona'a lefisha kol yodim shadarkam la'arev kain uvecheskes kain konim. He says, because since that becomes the convention, then people know that that's how they manufacture wine in this geographic location. And so there's no deception involved because it's a standard practice, right? So, I mean, the general rule as you're getting the gist of this is that anything that's standard practice in manufacture that the public is already aware of, there's no deception involved and it's not onah. But if something is not standard practice, so then it's going to be aser. And therefore he says, Umishan yisarif mayim biyeno yoser mikashir shadarkam la'arev. But if water gets mixed in that is of a higher percentage than the standard, let's say people put in 10% water to 90% wine. And for some reason, your workers, whether with your knowledge or without your knowledge, they put in 15% water to 85% wine. O achar hagitos. Or let's say they did it, they added the water not while the wine was fermenting, but after it had already finished fermentation, they added water afterwards. O b'makom shelo nahagu la'arev. Or they added water in a place where that is not the convention to add water. So in all of those cases, hareza lo yimkarenu b'chanus, ela imkein hodia lakona. So he says, then you're not even allowed to sell this wine unless you notify all of your customers, meaning you put on a big sign that says 85% wine, 15% water, right? You know, Kedem has a great new product. It's called light grape juice, right? It's a great new product. As a matter of fact, I could sell it for a lot less money than they sell it for, because the regular Kedem grape juice, let's say it sells for $6 a bottle. The light Kedem grape juice also sells for $6 a bottle. But lo and behold, all they're doing is taking regular grape juice and adding water to it in a certain ratio, such that you still taste like grape juice, and it's still halachically grape juice, you know, for making bari pri hagafen. But they realized that the market, that there's a market for lower calorie grape juice. And how do you make lower calorie grape juice? You add water to it. And that's, so when it first came out, I said to my wife, I can't understand why you're buying this light grape juice. Just buy the regular grape juice and add 25% water to it. And that's light grape juice. Well, of course, I lost that argument, as I normally do, because you know, the consumer cannot be bothered to do these things themselves. So it's the convenience of having it packaged in the right ratio, which is what the consumer is willing to pay for. So fortunately, on the Kedem bottle right there, it tells you how much percentage of grape juice. I think it says 60% grape juice or something like that, right there on the label. So as long as you market it correctly, as long as there's full transparency and you're marketing it correctly, there's no isser to it, because the consumer knows exactly what he or she is getting. And therefore, in that scenario, you're allowed to sell it in a store to your customers. But what you're not allowed to do is you're not allowed to sell it to another retailer. So for example, if I'm a manufacturer and my workers manufactured wine and they added an inordinate amount of water to it, so then it's mutter for me to sell it, because I know that I'm going to be honest and I'm going to disclose to the consumer that there's a certain higher percentage of water content. But I'm not allowed to sell it to somebody else who purchases and wants to sell it himself and for resale. And the reason why is because and he may be unscrupulous. He may not be as ethical as I am. And therefore, anything that could potentially be used to deceive the public, I'm not allowed to be a party to. Now, of course, this is very subjective, but in this particular example, this wine that has had a higher percentage of water mixed into it looks exactly like any other wine. And therefore, you have to not only be careful about yourself, but you have to be careful and worried that put into the hands of another unscrupulous individual, that person may exploit the fact that it looks exactly the same and may misrepresent it as wine. So if I have something like remember we talked about before, like false weights and measures, you're not even allowed to have it in your home, even if you're not using it, right? You have to destroy it, because who knows, someone else may come along and use it, and damage will result. So here too, if you have water, the higher water content of this wine may cause other people to exploit the the ignorance of the public. So you have to be careful. Only you can sell it, but you can't give it to other or sell it to other people for resale. It can only be for the end user. Okay. Next, Chaf Gimel.
Rabbi, it's interesting. They almost use that percentage of fruit juice as a positive claim, even if it's really low. Like I've seen pop that says 5% real fruit juice, which means 95% of it is garbage.
Right.
But the full disclosure, and it's exactly what the rabbi is saying about they're not misleading the customer, but the customer is almost misleading themselves by thinking that's a positive.
Yeah. Yeah. Well, it's I guess
Yeah.
compared to
Carried emperor, I guess it's
yeah,
disclosed.
compared to other soda which has 0% fruit juice, it's a big thing, right? It's like the junk food that says all natural ingredients, right? Well, what is all natural ingredients? It means that's totally meaningless.
Yeah. Fats are natural.
Yeah, right. Chaf Gimel. V'chol ze b'makom she'ein kol hakonim yayin tom min tchila. Abol b'makom shenagu shekol mi shekona yayin tomo tchila mutter la'arif bo mayim la'olam. So he says all of the aforementioned as far as selling wine that has a higher water content is only where the convention is that the customer purchases a sealed bottle. But let's say you live in a location where they don't bottle the wine, but rather you come with your own jerry can to pick up the wine, and the customer always tastes the wine first. I used to, when I was yeshiva bacher years ago, there was a winemaker in Mea Sharim, but like he could have lived 2 centuries before I bought the wine from him, because he probably used the same methods and the same hygienic standards that were used in the 1800s or the 1700s. And so next to his barrel where he was fermenting his wine, he had a shot glass that was attached with a string to the barrel, so that every customer who came to buy a bottle or would bring his jerry can, he poured them a cup in the shot glass and said, "You must taste it first." And so I declined his very generous offer, not knowing where that glass had been before. But in any event, the convention was in many places that you tasted the wine before you bought it, because it wasn't sold in sealed bottles. It was sold, like in various different kinds. Usually, many times, the customer brought his container. As a matter of fact, anytime you look in the Gemara, that was the convention. Certainly in the times of the Gemara, when you were a customer coming to buy wine from a winemaker, the winemaker kept his wine in barrels. He would attach a spigot to the barrel, and you would come with your own container, and you would purchase wine that way. And so the convention, therefore, was for everyone to taste the wine before they bought it. So therefore, in that situation, you're not obligated to disclose the water content, because the buyer will be able to taste it. The inyan shiargish hatoamo. So in other words, assuming that the customer will be able to already detect it by tasting it, so then you don't have to give any kinds of express disclosures. Uvemakom she'ein hakol toamin asur la'ariv afilu yain kasher berach achar hagitos. He says, but if some people do and some people don't, so then you're not allowed to unless you give full disclosure. He says, it's also going to be usher to blend different kinds of wines after the fermentation process is finished, because that's not the convention. So let's say to mix a soft wine with a hard wine is what he's basically saying. It's certain types of wine are easier on the palate than others. They're smoother on the palate than others. Shaharach yoser tov lishtos mehakasha. He says because the smoother wine is easier to drink. The gam damav yikarim yoser, and it costs more. So therefore, it would not be legal to go ahead and blend wines without that disclosure to the customer. Aval harach b'kasha mutter. He says, but what you are allowed to do is you're allowed to take a hard wine, meaning a wine that's cheaper and more difficult to drink. You're allowed to blend in a softer wine and in order to soften the entire flavor, as long as you don't misrepresent it to the consumer. Uvein hagitos mutter, afilu kasha berach mipnei shekeshenostin ma'at kasha berach ben hagitos umashbicho shemiskayim. And while the wine is fermenting, you're even allowed to add a small amount of the hard wine to the soft wine. He says, because that's also convention, that it's not done to conceal anything, it's done to improve the quality of the wine. Because when you have a smooth, soft wine, it tastes better and it's more expensive, but it also spoils faster. So one of the conventions of winemakers is that they will add a certain percentage of the harder, I guess, the wine that's a little bit harder to drink, and they'll add it to the soft wine in order to provide it with longer shelf life. Aval b'makom shehakol to'amin techila, muter la'arev la'olam be'inyan shi'argish hatomo. But again, he says, when everyone tastes the wine before they buy it, that's the convention. So then you're allowed to sell it without any kind of disclaimer before you sell it, because the wine's flavor will be detectable. So it's provided that the flavor is easily detected by everyone, so then you don't have to give any disclaimer. Okay. Next, Chaf Daled. Asr la'arev shmarim biyayin, o sha'ar mashkim, afilu kol shehu v'limkar bistam. You're not allowed to mix the shamarim, which is the pulp and the dregs of the wine. So to deliberately go ahead and add dregs or add pulp to the wine in order to save money on the finished product is going to be asr, unless, again, you give disclosure that dregs have been added. Umikol makom im kana mimenu chavis yayin shalema kol mida bekach bekach kesheba limdod yachol la'arif hashmorim im hayayin umocher lo hakol biyachad. He says, but if a person's coming to buy a large quantity, let's say he's going to buy a full barrel of wine, right? I'm not obligated to remove the dregs. If the dregs is a natural sort of admixture within the wine, I can sell him the entire barrel, and I'm not obligated to remove the dregs. Well, that's provided that that's the convention. In other words, if the convention of the locale is different, where there's a requirement on all of the merchants to remove the dregs, then I have to do so as well. But what I'm not allowed to do is I'm not allowed to take the dregs from one barrel and mix it into this barrel. He says, because that actually, in other words, even if I'm bringing it up to its normal percentage of what standard percentage of dregs to wine, but I'm not allowed to take it from another barrel. And the reason is because that could damage the quality of the wine. So therefore, I have to be careful that even if though I'm allowed a certain amount of dreg content based on the convention, I don't make a point of taking from another barrel to be able to supplement the dregs in this barrel, because that could actually damage the wine quality. I'm trying to think. I think that, like also there's a certain allowable amount when you sell commodities like soybeans and things like that. The government allows a certain percentage of pebbles to be present, or waste product to be present in the grain, so to speak. All of these are based on, today we have, of course, we have inspectors, and we have, so many laws that regulate these kinds of practices. So many of these halachas don't really apply today anymore, because when you buy things in the supermarket, all of these laws are regulated and everything's disclosed on the label. But again, these are some of the medieval practices, and we'll do the last two. We'll save those for tomorrow, and then just for you to know that right after that, we're going to get into a very fascinating topic, which is on the next page, called Ona'as Devarim, which has to do with not unfair business practices, deceptive business practices, but the isser of oppressing someone verbally, hurting people's feelings, which is also a form of ona'ah. Like I remember when we started this chapter, I said there's two types of ona'ah. There's ona'as mamon, harming someone financially by deceiving them, and also ona'as devarim, which is harming someone verbally by saying things that are hurtful to them. And we're going to discuss how the halacha codifies what you are and are not allowed to say to another human being in order to avoid hurting their feelings. So Mir Hashem will do that. We'll start that at least tomorrow. Okay. Any questions, comments? If not, have a great day.
I guess that's kind of like a naturally occurring, what we talked about before with the pebbles or with the dregs or whatever. It's like what's naturally part of the process. You're allowed to have
Yeah,
this.
although one can argue that there's always a filtration system whenever you're selling agricultural goods. The question is how to what degree am I obligated to filter out the bad from the good?
Right.
And so a lot of that today is regulated. Have a good day, everybody.
Thank you very much.